go ahead and get started with the second panel of speakers. It is my privilege to introduce the moderator for our second panel of speakers today, Professor Matt Lampkin. Professor Lampkin joined the TU College of Law after 2 years as a fellow at Stanford Law School's Center for Law and the Biosciences. Prior to entering academia, he was in private practice in Chicago and Illinois, clerked for a federal judge, and worked as a policy advisor to the mayor of Indianapolis. Professor Lampkin's scholarship explores the intersection of healthcare, law, and ethics, with a particular focus on how the increasing commercialization of medical care is reshaping our understanding of disease and disability, informed consent and personal responsibility, and the role of government in regulating medical care. Please join me in welcoming Professor Matt Lampkin.
Thanks very much. We are now beginning the dark suits and beards section. Misidentified on the schedule as healthcare philosophy. I have the privilege of introducing two very distinguished speakers. It is also something of a challenge because their list of accomplishments is sufficiently long that if I attempt to take you through them, they wouldn't have any time to speak. So I hope that they and you will forgive me for leaving off vast swaths of those accomplishments in my introductory remarks. Our first speaker is Syed. He's assistant professor of law at Berkeley Law School, where he teaches IP, health law, legal theory, and torts. His research interests include legal theory and political philosophy, with a particular focus on intellectual property and innovation, including a co-authored publication in Yale Law Journal this year, as well as allocation of healthcare resources, a subject he's going to be discussing today. Professor Syed has a BA from the University of Western Ontario, an LLB from the University of Victoria, and is an SJD candidate at Harvard Law School. Yeah. Where he was also an academic fellow at the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics. Today he's going to be discussing rights versus distributive approaches to allocating healthcare.
Slide. I'm just going to put this up.
Do me the ignorance, Judy, shutting that thing down.
All right, thanks. All right, great. So I'm actually going to follow on a bit of what. Yes. So yeah.
Should we flip the order? I'm sorry, I must have gotten the order wrong. I can blanket it.
I don't mind.
That's not distracting, right?
There we go. That's not distracting. I don't know what that. Yeah.
Come to see that name up there. Yeah.
So I'm actually going to speak on the same piece that Chris spoke about this morning, Einer's 1994 piece, Allocating Healthcare Morally. I'm going to talk about it from a normative philosophical perspective. I just want to echo Chris's remarks about how seminal and wide-ranging this article is. I think it represents Einer at his best, a high-powered master of all trades, showing complete felicity with moral philosophy, economics, and doing something he calls comparative paradigm analysis, which I don't think you've ever picked up on again, but I guess that's Einer's idea of what good legal scholarship is. It's a kind of attempt to master a number of disciplines and then bring them to bear on specific institutional policy questions, and I don't think there's many scholars today who do it as well as Einer. So what I want to quickly recap is some of the core claims of Einer's piece, and then the part that I'm going to take off on, building on his work, and also to some extent offering a friendly amendment / critique of one aspect of it. So Einer's claim is that to some extent we need to have some redistribution of healthcare resources in healthcare because of a social discomfort with allocating healthcare according to market purchasing power, to each according to willingness and ability to pay, and so therefore healthcare does involve some redistribution. It involves redistribution according to income, but also to some extent in terms of health status, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The way to deal with the trade-offs that healthcare involves, Einer rightly points out, can't be resolved through some sort of moral absolutism that every health increment that can be purchased should be purchased, because that'll lead to a bottomless pit of spending on healthcare. and that there's an inadequacy of any alternatives, technical, medical criteria of health need. All criteria ultimately involve opportunity costs with respect to different social allocation of resources among patients or among health and other alternatives. And finally, Einer has, I think, incredibly persuasive and very subtle critiques of the two alternative approaches that philosophers tend to be attracted to when dealing with healthcare questions, to the one that he then half-heartedly embraces, which are, so the approach that I'm going to talk about and that I'm going to offer a friendly amendment to is the idea that ultimately rationing in healthcare has to involve some kind of forthright commitment to measuring and trading off different health benefits across different patients in the population. So I'm going to call that, I guess, sort of a benefit measurement and trading off. Whether or not we should do benefit maximization is a separate question, but the idea is we need some sort of systematic way of evaluating different health outcomes and trading them off against different patients and different needs and different life stages. So this systematic approach is contrasted with two others that moral philosophers are often drawn towards. One is random, lottery, coin flipping, using cues or other mechanisms to deal with these questions. And Einer's critique, I think, of this is very persuasive, very subtle, very powerful, and I'm not going to speak on it much except to bring it up near the end as a problematic aspect of his own approach, which I'll connect with at some point. And the other thing that Einer, I think, very powerfully critiques is the idea that you can deal with these normative questions, these social policy questions, simply by recourse to individual consent. And I'll say why that doesn't work, and Einer's critique of that is very persuasive on that front as well, I think. And so now just to, I guess, basically set up where I'm going. Einer suggests, I think, interestingly, that the overall budget for healthcare should probably be set around the overall budget of a socially provided healthcare right should be what the average middle class income purchaser would provide for themselves. And then within that overall budget, each individual should choose among different plans, which each offer a different menu of group health maximization. And then the plans are reimbursed according to how many enrollees they have, with a risk adjustment for the enrollee's pre-existing health status, so that plans don't have the incentive to only enroll healthy patients, but that if they enroll patients with pre-existing tendencies towards illness, that will be reflected in their reimbursements. Fundamentally, I want to frame the problem with Einer's solution being the lack of clarity with how to go about doing the risk adjustment for people with differential health needs. And so now, just to frame the issue that I want to discuss today, it's as follows. I understand health to be a particularly important area of a general question in moral philosophy of justice, which is unchosen differential needs. People who have health needs or, say, needs in educational resources owing to personal capacities and the social cost of meeting those needs, which are higher than average due to no fault of their own. People with disability of some sort of dysfunction or pain that is less than the social average, which they haven't earned, which requires, if they are to be brought up to the average, greater resources than for other people. Unchosen differential needs. And what I want to suggest is that this is probably the sharpest question that distributively or morally that healthcare raises. And what I want to do is provide what I understand to be a systematic approach to this question, as opposed to more ad hoc approaches. And then within the systematic approach, argue for a distributive justice approach, which is in contrast with two alternative distributive justice approaches, which can be called maximization or utilitarianism and equality. So I want to contrast the approach I'm going to advance with maximization and equality. Okay. So just now to set up the problem. In the literature that Einer helped inaugurate, and actually we have Ari Rai here, who's also contributed an incredibly important piece of this literature, it's generally acknowledged that the two fundamental normative questions facing social policy and healthcare are the following. One, how much of the overall budget of society's resources should be devoted to healthcare as a matter of general social commitment, leaving discretionary spending to individuals who may wish to do so. And second, how much of that overall budget should be distributed to which individuals for which health needs at which stages of their life. So the first question is how much to allocate aggregately, and the second question is how to distribute that aggregate allocation across different health needs of different individuals at different stages of life. The literature usually begins by recognizing that in this area, unlike others, we can't rely on simply aggregating individual market decisions. Three fundamental reasons for this are, first, the existing background distribution of income and wealth strikes many people as probably not just, and allocating health care according to willingness and ability to pay is an especially egregious, for many people, instance of injustice of market distribution. Second, there are individuals with pre-existing conditions or illnesses through no fault of their own who will have more expensive health needs and will either be unable to get health insurance, or if they do, will pay much higher premiums than the rest of the population, and this strikes many people as unfair. Third, acquiring healthcare through insurance introduces a series of problems that Chris has ably discussed already. Fundamentally, people are not cost sensitive. There's a time asymmetry between when you buy the insurance package and when you get the health itself, which makes your choices in either stage perfectly reliable. And finally, there's a phenomenon of hyperbolic discounting, which is that if you buy health at a young age for your older self, you will have a tendency to discount the benefits you'll get at an older age. And if at the same time we allow the older age person to simply stipulate how much health they want, then they're unaccountable with respect to how much they spent on it in their youth. So fundamentally, there are these three issues that healthcare presents. A, the poor. B, differential needs of the disabled. And three, age. And what I want to now outline is how one approach, which I find to be a plausible beginning, is cost effectiveness analysis, which suggests that to ration between these questions within an overall budget, what we ought to do, ideally, is to try to figure out how much different interventions provide in terms of health benefit on average for different people with different conditions, and thereby ultimately aim to produce a maximum amount of healthcare benefit per dollar resource spent. So fundamentally, cost effectiveness analysis metrics like QALYs, quality adjusted life years, aim to capture two fundamental ideas. One, they aim to capture an intersocial average understanding of the goodness and badness associated with different health conditions. They have people compare in surveys, or doctors and experts compare how bad is it to have a certain disability, how bad is it to be in a certain state of pain, and how much relief would be provided by different interventions, to try to get a sense of, across many individuals, the measure of goodness and badness of different health outcomes. And then second, which is more controversial, cost effectiveness analysis then suggests what we ought to do ideally is then maximize our bang for the buck in terms of aggregate CEA maximization, or reducing or improving as much as we can the QALYs per dollar. So that's not about measuring health states, but that's about balancing off or trading off across people how much each person should get. It's an implicit idea of what is fair across the population. And the fairness judgment in CEA maximization is what's fair is to maximize aggregate health per dollar. So this fairness judgment involves a number of controversies which have been raised, and I just wanted to focus mainly on one, but let me just mention a couple others. One is, some people find it controversial that how much health you get, how much interventions you get, is a function of how long an intervention can prolong your life. So the idea is, if one person gets 20 more years, the other person gets 10 more years, everything else being equal, the intervention goes to the person whose life is prolonged by 20 years. Most people find that persuasive when it's 20 versus 10 years, but if you make it 20 years versus 19 years and 10 months, people start balking. So there's this idea that it's problematic to allocate healthcare according to how much life years will be extended. Another issue is that some people feel that a trade-off between life and mere quality of life shouldn't be made in the way quality suggests. Quality suggests that they're on the same scale, that at some point it's trade-offable to extend one person's life for a year versus another person simply massively improving the quality of their life for a year. Many people think saving life is somehow lexically prior, qualitatively different than any form of health improvement. I'm going to bracket those two questions in my discussion here and focus on a third question that's raised by using a quality approach. And that third question is that qualities systematically may be biased against those who have pre-existing health conditions or illnesses, those who are disabled. And I'm going to quickly discuss, well, there's three sorts of instances where this can happen. One, which I'll call plateauing or trailing off. Someone who has a disability, someone who has a chronic health condition, may simply not be able to be brought up to the same stage of health as someone without that disability, although they can still be consistently improved in increasingly small increments. So more and more resources can be devoted to improving them less and less. But nevertheless, they'll never quite reach, or they won't reach the same status as people without that disability without an exorbitant amount of resources. So this is the sort of trailing off or plateauing issue. Then there's a second one, which is comorbidity. Someone who has a pre-existing health condition, say some sort of a mobility problem, may be able to benefit less from a health intervention than someone without that pre-existing condition. A hip replacement may be able to provide more health benefit for someone who's otherwise healthy than for someone who's got some other pre-existing condition. So the disability can affect the prognosis from a specific health intervention. So this is a comorbidity problem. And then the third problem is that if you take into account a background disability, someone is blind, someone has hearing impairment, and then ask who should get this heart surgery, someone without the disability, someone with the disability, qualities as a measure of their overall life, you will tend to favor giving health improvements and health interventions to those who otherwise have no disability, because they're in general enjoying more health. And if you want to improve population health, it's better to help people who don't have pre-existing conditions to reattain full health than to help people who have already pre-existing disability conditions. So these are the three cases. Einer's approach to the question is to suggest that, and it's an approach that in fact already Rise taken to some extent, Dan Brock, a number of very powerful, subtle thinkers have decided that there's two approaches that are problematic. One approach is to simply maximize health benefits across all three cases and provide health interventions according to how much you will get marginal improvements, which means that in each case, the person with a disability will be disadvantaged. They find that troubling for the third case. The third case being the one in which there's an unrelated background disability. There they suggest that in fact, the unrelated background disability should not be factored in. And if someone with a disability can improve as much with this intervention with respect to this condition, then someone without the disability, they should be treated equally. There should be a non-discrimination principle with respect to unrelated background conditions. But at the same time, they don't think that disability shouldn't be factored in the first two cases, and they accept the principle that we should probably aim to maximize health benefits in the first two cases, which will result in systematically giving less resources to those with pre-existing conditions. And so it's a mix between a utilitarian approach or a maximization approach for the first two cases, and then a kind of rights approach of non-discrimination for the last case. And it seems to me this approach is problematic for two reasons. First, it doesn't provide a persuasive, principled reason why the last case is different than the first two. Why is it that in the case where someone's background disability will affect their overall health, we don't factor it in, but when their disability will affect how much they can reap improvements from this intervention, we do factor it in? If you want to systematically improve population health, it would seem you want to factor in overall health levels in both cases. I think it's more problematic for a second reason, which is that I think the idea that those with pre-existing conditions should only be assisted in the first two cases when their marginal improvement will be as much or more than those without a background condition is itself normatively troubling. I think in general, health benefit maximization is a troubling systematic principle to pursue. And so what I want to now suggest is an alternative approach to health benefit maximization, or what I think Einer suggests, which is health benefits maximization restricted or qualified by a kind of anti-discriminatory principles in certain intuitive cases. And this alternative approach, what I want to suggest, is a distributive justice approach, which basically suggests that fundamentally what's going on in all these differential needs cases has to be understood in terms of fairness across persons with respect to access to resources for enjoying maximal health in line with other people's legitimate claims. And what that means, in the way I understand it, is to reject two basic premises that divide most of the philosophical literature. The first premise is that maximization or efficiency across a group is in itself somehow valuable. It seems to me maximization or efficiency across a group is simply an incoherent and senseless goal to pursue in the abstract. In the abstract, what we don't want is a large aggregate amount of happiness. That would require having more and more people who are on average maybe less and less happy, but there's more of them. And that in itself is good somehow because there's an aggregately high amount of happiness in the world. This seems to be the goal. And what seems to be more plausible is that this idea of maximizing the average or the aggregate captures something, which is that everything else being equal, two principles of moral, of normative commitment captured by utilitarianism are true. One, numbers matter in making decisions across people, so that if you can help two people out, it's better with the same benefit than one. That's better to do. That's one principle in utilitarianism, which I think is plausible. And the other, the one relevant here, is everything else being equal, marginal improvements are relevant considerations in interpersonal fairness. If A can be helped out 10 and B can be helped out 9, if there's no other information we have about their desert or any other aspects of their life, then it seems plausible that we should help out A more than B. How much we can help each person out marginally would seem to be a relevant fairness consideration. That seems to me right. But that's not about maximizing an average or an aggregate. That's about looking at marginal improvements as a relevant normative consideration. Then the other view in the philosophical literature is that we should somehow seek to equalize outcomes. This seems to me equally unpersuasive and arguably senseless. In the abstract, what we're interested in, I want to suggest, is not equal outcomes. As if it's okay if two people who never know each other, one is at 10 and the other is at 5, that's an inequality, they're never going to meet, and it's a better society if A, who's no longer at 10, is at 8, because now 8 and 5 is more equal. Equalizing counsels leveling down in principle. That in principle it's better, even if people don't know each other, that their lots in life be more equal, even if they're overall less well off each. But that seems to me unpersuasive. Equality masks what we really care about, which is fairness with respect to overall levels. Which means that what we want to do is, everything else being equal, someone who is worse off than another should probably be given a greater claim over resources. Not because we want to equalize, but because fairness demands priority to the worse off vis-a-vis others, where no other considerations are at play. So I suggest if you have these two principles, dislocated from equality and dislocated from maximization. One, fairness says, to each according to marginal improvement is a relevant consideration. When someone can be improved more than another, they get greater claim. The other claim is, when someone's overall level of well-being is worse off than the other, they get a greater claim. And I suggest there's a very intuitive, natural, plausible way to combine these two principles, which is the principle I suggest, which is called the principle of proportionate benefit sacrifice, which is the idea that between two people, neither of whom has deserved a resource in terms of past responsibility, in terms of earning the resource or putting themselves in this state. So we're not factoring in considerations of responsibility or desert. Between these two people, there are two relevant factors that have to be looked at. One, how much can each be improved in terms of health or some other function of improvement? And two, how badly off is or how well off are their lives going overall? So if there's a trade-off between, say, me and Einar with respect to a claim on resources, and assume he can improve more in health than I can, and his life is going off, his health overall is better than mine, the argument I would suggest is the following, that I have a greater claim to the resource than Einar, given the fact that he already enjoys overall greater health than me. Fairness demands that if neither of us have deserved our lots, I be brought up before he be improved further. But he's got a claim, which is, if he's going to improve more than I am, stand to reap greater gains, fairness also demands that that be factored in, so that I'm not given any incrementally small improvement at the expense of large sacrifices for him simply because I'm still worse off. That would counsel a bottomless pit. And so fundamentally I'm suggesting what we look at is how much improvement does each person stand to reap as a function of how well overall their life or health is. And that way, I suggest, provides a plausible reconciliation of our intuitions in all three cases, in that we always factor in for the disabled the fact that their overall health is worse off, but we always also factor in the fact that they may not improve as much as others, and that both are always and systematically to be factored in, rather than one factored in exclusively in some cases, the other factored in exclusively in other cases, and sometimes both ignored with some third metric or third approach, which is not systematic but intuitive and ad hoc. Okay, 30 minutes on. No, I'm going to stop. Great, thanks.
I hope you're all duly impressed by my inability to keep a list of two speakers in the improper order. But that just happens. It takes a lot of work to accomplish that. So thank you for rolling with it. I appreciate it. Our next speaker is Cohen. He is a professor of law at Harvard Law School. He's also co-director of the Petrie-Flom Center and a leading expert on the intersection of bioethics and the law. His scholarship has included projects on medical tourism, reproductive technology, end-of-life decision-making, and research ethics. I am told by people who have had an opportunity to see Glenn work that he will disappear behind his office door for a few hours and emerge with a fully formed law review article. Judging from the list of publications, that seems to be true. His work has appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine, the Journal of Law, Medicine, and Ethics, and a raft of law reviews, including Stanford, Georgetown, USC, and many others. Glenn has a BA from the University of Toronto and a JD from Harvard Law School, and today he's going to be speaking on biomedical enhancement technologies.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the law school and to the law review for bringing us here. It's my first time in Oklahoma, and I'm really, really enjoying it. But I want to subtract 10% of the thank you from Matt Lampkin for the following reason. It is a punishment to have to finish. I had to follow Tala Syed, right? When I was first, I was confident that I would sound okay, but I will slavishly need to look at my notes in a way that he doesn't. He can just keep going and give you a lecture about a grand theory of healthcare distribution. But at least I have a full 4 hours, I think, before Einar speaks. So at least I'm ahead of Einar on the queue, and I say this for the following reason. Einar is just brilliant. I try as hard as I can to be good at my field. Einar is a master of 4 fields: antitrust, contracts, statutory interpretation, and of course health law and bioethics, which we're talking about now, right? The polite way of putting this is when he enters the room, the average IQ goes up dramatically. The less polite way of putting it, which is the way I usually feel, is that in every conversation we ever have, I am acutely aware that I'm not as smart as I think I am, because he is way smarter. Einar, you are a wonderful mentor to me. You've been a wonderful friend, and I just wish those of you who don't know Einar that you can have someone in your life who will do the kinds of things for you and help you in your life and your career the way Einar has for me, because it's really, really a privilege to get to honor you today. Okay, so with that said, I've made a smart decision, and the decision, I think it's smart. You'll tell me if it's smart or not. What I think the smart decision to take is I'm going to riff on something Einar hasn't published yet. And that way you won't know how much what I say suffers by comparison to what he's working on, right? So he has an unpublished book on enhancement called Reengineering Humans, What Limits? That's still kind of being toyed with. And I'm going to give my views of enhancement and riff a little bit on his own. So I'm going to start by offering what I call a reconstructive taxonomy of enhancements. Those who know me, they often say in legal academia there are splitters and there are joiners. I'm definitely a splitter, right? I've never seen a problem that was complex that I couldn't make more complex, and that's what I'm going to do at first by breaking it up. The second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to offer a taxonomy of legal and regulatory interventions. And then I'm going to try to sketch some of the major arguments and my thoughts on them as to what's wrong with enhancement. And I think the more novel thing is a question that's not often asked is, what is right with enhancement, right? So let's start. Okay. So this is my attempt to try to map out all of enhancement discourse in one slide, which is always fun, right? So I begin by trying to divide biological versus non-biological enhancement. When people talk about enhancement, I think they often have biology in mind, but there's lots of non-biological enhancements. All learning, all training, LSAT tutoring for prospective law students, for example, that is an enhancement. Sometimes these non-biological enhancements take the form of add-ons rather than alterations. So Google Glass, when it comes out, I think is a good example of an add-on that is a non-biological enhancement. And sometimes the link, I think, between these add-ons versus actually alterations are going to be blurred. So if you'll permit me to geek out for a moment, right? You think about Star Trek: The Next Generation, right? In the actual original series, you have Lieutenant Geordi LaForge with his visor, right? That's an add-on. It helps him to see. In the first and second Star Trek movies, before the most recent reboot, the Next Generation movies, he has these special eyes that have been altered, right? That is a biological alteration, right? So I don't think there's much difference between the visor and the special eyes, right? Some people do, but this is the distinction why I want to say this line between biological and non-biological enhancements might be important. Amongst biological enhancements, we can further distinguish genetic enhancements from non-genetic but still biological enhancements. So Einar has a nice example of using a beta blocker. There's an Olympic athlete, I think he was South Korean if I remember, who's basically turfed and his bronze medal removed. He was an archer because he used a beta blocker to try to make him a little bit more steady. Lots of orchestral players use beta blockers for exactly this reason, right? We take another science fiction example. In Gattaca, when Vincent breaks his legs and has them lengthened for that reason in stress, that's biological, but not genetic, right? So why should genetic enhancements be singled out? They often are in this literature. I'm actually not sure they should, but if I was trying to offer an argument for why they might be different, is that they may be passed on to future generations, but only if that's a germline alteration rather than a somatic cell alteration. It's also possible that they are actually a proxy for another, what I do think might be a morally relevant category, which is that of reversibility, right? That genetic alterations are ordinarily thought of as irreversible. That may not be true in the future. At the moment they are. There are also lots of non-biological and non-genetic alterations that are irreversible. So I think if that's what we're worried about, if the question is reversibility, we should focus on reversibility rather than using this as a proxy. Okay. Second level of distinction is between choosing for ourselves, self-enhancement, versus choosing for others who cannot themselves give full assent. And here the main example, I think, that concerns people is enhancing our children. Within enhancing our children, you can distinguish enhancing before birth versus after birth. An example of after birth would be giving your child human growth hormone. When we're talking about before birth, we can change, for example, the distinction between, I think this is important in my work, enhancing by selection versus enhancing by manipulating already fertilized eggs or already implanted embryos that have become fetuses, right? So you could, and people do, especially single individuals or individuals who are gay and lesbian, when they go to sperm banks to get what's missing, they often do a certain level of shopping, right? There was actually briefly the Center for Germinal Choice, which was supposed to be a Nobel Prize winning sperm bank. You had to be a Nobel Prize winner. They couldn't get enough Nobel Prize winners, so they surreptitiously lowered the standards dramatically, and if you had a PhD from anywhere, you were in, right? But there's lots of people who apparently care about these things, right? So there is this way of enhancing via selection. as opposed to, at least in the future, it might be possible to genetically manipulate something that's already been fertilized, right? We already can take off one cell at the 8-cell stage and do PGD on it, for example. We could swap in a different cell, perhaps, in the future. Then we have a distinction in terms of the types of enhancement, what you are trying to enhancement. Some enhancements are Swiss Army knives, in the sense that they can improve your prospects of a child, whatever the child chooses to do with his life. For example, intelligence or disease resistance. Disease resistance is a good example. Most think that is an all-purpose Swiss Army knife enhancement. By contrast, there's other kinds of enhancements that are going to limit options, right? NBA, if you want your child to play by the NBA, you want to be tall. That's going to make it harder for him to work on a submarine, for example, right? The same is true, by the way, about non-biological enhancements. Helping a child improve the skill level at which he or she reads by making her practice is an enhancement that is compatible with many life plans in our society. By contrast, making your child play piano for 5 hours a day is going to foreclose other types of life plans, like sports, like having friends, for example, and limit options in the future. I don't play piano. This is nothing. If you're out there watching this in the outside world, if you play piano, it's great. I have nothing against piano. I just think it may not be compatible with all life plans, that level. Okay, then we can distinguish a reversible versus irreversible enhancements, right? If one's genes are made better by the choice of the genetic material used by your parents, that's usually something that currently, at least, can't be altered in the future. Your genotype is set. Your phenotype may change a little bit. On the other extreme, there are enhancements that are easily undone. For example, an artificial limb, right? I can remove it if I don't want it on there. And in between, there are alterations that might be undone, but only at significant cost, or perhaps redone. So if you have a rhinoplasty, a nose job as an enhancement, and you want to go back to your original nose, I mean, probably the doctor can give a facsimile of your original nose if you had a second one. So that's not quite undoing it, but it's at least kind of redoing it, if you will. Notice the way that this distinction interfaces with the distinction between enhancing yourself versus enhancing your children. In self-enhancement, irreversible enhancements raise special concerns that are paternalistic, that people are going to make poor decisions that they'll later not be able to undo. When it's about enhancing our children, by contrast, and this has a resemblance to other kinds of body alterations like male circumcision or female genital cutting, there is this question that you're making a decision for the child that the child can no longer reduce, which may itself interface with the distinction between Swiss Army knives compatible with many life plans versus choosing a life plan for your child. Okay, then there is a distinction sometimes made in the literature between enhancement versus treatment. Some think that there is a problem with making children better than well, but not with curing diseases. For example, Norm Daniels at Harvard draws a distinction between species-typical functioning and thinks we have an obligation to fund treatments that ensure that there's a level of functioning up to species-typical functioning, but not beyond that. Many, and I think I speak for Elhaig and for myself here, are skeptical about this line and think actually they're making a classic baseline problem of the kind we try to cure people of in the first year of law school, right? But there are people out there who think this is a real distinction. Then within this distinction, I think you can actually do a further distinction between enhancements that would bring people to the upper bounds of what people already have versus enhancements that add to the upper bound of humanity as it now stands. So, for example, extending our life to the oldest living person as opposed to extending it much further, or to be really strange about it, adding bat wings to human beings, for example. That would be an enhancement that doesn't happen naturally. So why do people are attracted to this distinction? It's a bit mysterious to me. If I'm trying to be charitable, I think that maybe they're thinking one of three things. One, given that there currently exist human beings who have the trait in question, by seeking it for oneself, you're indisputably still remaining a human being as we now understand the concept. If by contrast you could live to 1,000 or grow wings or something that's not part of human nature, maybe you stop being human, and maybe that's important to some people. Second, maybe there's an unfairness in terms of what our genetic endowments already look like. There's a certain moral luck. Since the draw is random, we don't have control about what our parents chose to do or who they chose to marry or what they had to begin with. And doing this is just drawing again from a set deck, if you imagine from poker, like 7-card stud or something like that, as opposed to shuffling in a completely new deck. So maybe there's a fairness distinction between these two things. And third, maybe the issue here is actually why this is attractive, is it creates a kind of ceiling effect, which relates to a problem involving positional goods that Elhague has written on and I'll mention below. So maybe that's why people are attracted to this, but I think it's relatively under-theorized. And then last, in terms of distinctions about just what kinds of enhancements might be out there, and these are additive, right? We can characterize any enhancement by these 6 characteristics, or maybe 7 or 8 if you use the sub-distinctions. There is a distinction, and this is important for Einer's work, between absolute and positional goods, right? He uses the term transferred benefit and shared costs. Some goods, like being tall, are beneficial usually in a positional sense. They're beneficial because other people don't have them. By contrast, other goods, like immunity from disease, are absolute goods. They're desirable even if everybody else in the world had it. And in a weird way, this kind of mirrors Kant's categorical imperative, the formula, one of the formulas for it. He writes, act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law, right? That's his test for the good will. In a sense, the distinction between absolute goods and positional goods are, ask yourself, would you want it if I gave it to you, everybody else had it too, right? If you would still want it, then it's an absolute good. If not, it's only a positional good. Okay. So that taxonomy may not capture every enhancement, but it gets us far along in terms of categorizing things and understanding where the pressure points are. Then we go a little bit from philosophy into the law, right? And here I want to offer a second taxonomy about the way in which it's a simpler one, the law could deal with things. And the first kind of enhancement, the first distinction is permit versus prohibit. And then I want to be a little bit more sophisticated about what I mean by each. So in the permit category, there's no state sanction applied. It could just be that that's the end of it. The state just doesn't sanction it, doesn't do anything else. It's permitted. It's just a regular market good. But we could go further. There are other options here. Theoretically, instead of just permitting it, we could actually make it mandatory. If vaccination is considered a kind of enhancement, we actually do this with some vaccination, at least as a condition for attending school, which is required unless there's a good religious exemption. We could subsidize it, so whether or not it's mandatory, you could also subsidize it. We could require that individuals have insurance, that all insurance coverage have a mandated benefit to cover it. We could do a separate redistribution. We could make it free at a government clinic. We could also make it legal, permit it, but tax it, right? We could tax it separately from other goods and services, a kind of Pigouvian tax, right? In order to make us internalize whatever externalities it produces. We could also tax it in a different way to fund redistribution to people who don't have the enhancement or have bad moral luck, right? That would be another way of doing it. The first way is more like a vice tax, like what we do for suntan beds in the ACA. And by the way, suntanning might itself be considered a kind of enhancement, although one that has cost later in the time stream. And these guys know I like to go to Miami and get a suntan, so this one appeals to me. Finally, we can use nudges and other choice architecture techniques of the Sunstein and Thaler libertarian paternalism, things like speed bumps, psychological pre-screening, waiting or cooling off periods, similar to what we do for adoption, surrogacy, sex reassignment, and I've discussed elsewhere for organ markets. So that's the first set of bundles of interventions. The second are prohibit. And here I've been a little bit less picky about it, but the state could make something illegal. And within illegal, it could be a criminal offense to buy, sell, or use anabolic steroids, as it currently is now. We could also apply a civil fine. We could also have a notion of disgorgement, that whatever benefit you got, you have to disgorge in return. And in fact, Kurt Vonnegut, one of my favorite authors, imagines in his short story, Harrison Bergeron, which I highly recommend, he imagines a future of 2081 where, quote, everybody was finally equal. They weren't only equal before God and the law, they were equal in every which way. Nobody was smarter than anybody else. Nobody was better looking than anybody else. Nobody was stronger or quicker than anybody else. All this equality was due to the 211th, 212th, and 213th amendments to the U.S. Constitution and to the unceasing vigilance of agents of the United States Handicapper General, who I understand has permanent funding, so is not upset by government shutdowns, right? No discretionary funding there. And in this dystopic future that Vonnegut imagines, we've got George, whose intelligence is, quote, way above normal, but he has a little mental handicap radio in his ear that he is required by law to wear at all times. And every 20 seconds or so, the transmitter would send out some sharp voice to keep people like George from taking unfair advantage of that brain. And then we have a ballerina performing on television who we're told, quote, must have been extraordinarily beautiful because the mask she wore was hideous. And it was easy to see that she was the strongest and most graceful of all the dancers, for her handicaps were as big as those worn by 200-pound men, and so on, right? So this notion that we could try to cancel out enhancement by a kind of disgorgement. So that's legally prohibit. We could also not legally prohibit, but make it impose moral sanction. And that may mean that people who enhance would not be able to enjoy awards, for example, that couldn't be part of the Olympics, like the Korean archer. We could also use it as a bar for entering a competition. We could remove it around. Or we could add asterisks on, greatest hits and Hall of Fame records for people who used enhancements, right? We could use the same rules for adoptions for universities, orchestras, performances, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So that's our legal options. Well, what, if anything, is wrong with enhancement, okay? Starting from a mildly libertarian preference that I wanted to know at least one reason why we want to impose some speed bump. So one possibility is safety risk to the enhanced, right? But again, this is a very heterogeneous territory. Some biological enhancements, like Ritalin use, may pose only minor risks, such as stomach pain and headache. Others, like anabolic steroids, much greater risks. And for many of the enhancements, especially the genetics, we're in a case of nighting uncertainty. We're uncertain as to the distribution or probabilities, and not just where within a probability distribution a particular risk falls. Other enhancements, like SAT tutoring, pose no safety risk, although they're not costless, and that students pay for the services and they invest their time in it. Of course, many enhancements also promise benefits, the key reason why people want them. When individuals are choosing enhancements for themselves, the justification for legal intervention has to be paternalistic. We think they're going to make a bad decision of cost and benefit. By contrast, when it's about children, we're thinking a lot more in the parens patriae, family law way of thinking about this. There is a wrinkle here that I've discussed in my earlier work that I'll just mention here. I've discussed it mostly to creating disabilities, but you can also think about it creating to enhancement. And that is, for enhancement by selection, even if it imposes a safety risk, you may actually think those safety risks can't be easily thought of as harm to the child, because your choice in terms of what gametes you use in selection are going to affect which child comes into existence. So we have to think against the counterfactual. For that child, is there a way to have built that child without the safety risk? So that's just a wrinkle there related to Derek Parfit's non-identity problem. So again, I think these are realistic concerns, but they have to be scaled a little bit to the type of enhancement, and probably it's a small subset of enhancements that reach this constraint. A second concern has to do with distribution and inequality, and this is at the heart of Harrison Bergeron, and also, as my countryman Leonard Cohen put it, everybody knows the fight was fixed, the poor stay poor, the rich get rich, that's how it goes, and everybody knows. He's a gravelier voice than I do, so he does it even better, right? The idea is that the risk cuts across essentially, Artie White didn't think she was going to get serenaded today, right? But it's a special occasion, right? We have to serenade Einar a little bit, right? These risks cut across essentially all forms of enhancement, right? From cosmetic surgery to SAT tutoring. Maybe it's a little bit more salient as to positional goods because they're desired because they can enhance. But there are other ways of doing this too. So the obvious legal intervention that deals with this particular concern is to prohibit the enhancement in question. But that's pretty strong medicine. We could also diminish this concern by subsidizing it, right? The state could require all insurers to cover LASIK, eye surgery, Ritalin, and to be provocative purposefully, breast augmentation or anabolic steroid use, have that required by law to be covered, so there's no inequality in terms of access. It could also require all SAT tutoring companies to engage in need-blind admissions into their program or produce a fee waiver system similar to what we do for university admission. And we could imagine these subsidies could be more progressive or less progressive depending on the way in which we want to do them. We could also make these subsidies free for the taking, or we could actually make them mandated, right? So libertarians, at least when it comes to modification, may have a problem with this, but we could make them both subsidized and mandated as a way to avoid inequality problems, because then we'd be sure that everybody could get them, right? We do this with education. If you think of education as an enhancement, that's exactly what we do there. And a point that's sometimes overlooked here is that although enhancements raise this problem of inequality, they also in some ways solve a different problem of inequality that Tala averred to. And that is that we have moral luck in the distribution of our talents currently, right? And the question is, can we use enhancement as a way of trying to overcome that moral luck, to make the distribution of our talents more equal to begin with? And again, there's a question of whether you think this would be a good thing or a bad thing. Certainly, Harrison Bergeron, Vonnegut's view is that this is a bad thing. But maybe if we're leveling up rather than leveling down, it would be a good thing if we were all equally talented and we all have lots and lots of talents. Okay. A third concern is the coercion of voluntary enhancements. And again, the idea here is that if enhancements are not mandatory, even if they're subsidized, you have the option of taking one. But if you fail to enhance, you're going to suffer. So if we have a population of 100 identically situated individuals, if 50 of those individuals choose to enhance, they increase their share of the zero-sum goods in a society. And the other individuals in the society must either themselves enhance in order to compete. And the result is either a new equilibrium where everyone enhances, or at least many choose to enhance who would otherwise not choose to enhance otherwise. In some ways, this is a dynamic similar to concerns about minimum wage. We want to fix the minimum wage so we don't have a vicious circle of people underbidding one another. So I call this somewhat oxymoronically coerced voluntary enhancement, right? Because the enhancements are voluntary, but the dynamic it produces are somewhat coerced. And Chatterjee gives a good real-life example of pilots taking donepezil performed better in emergencies than those on placebos, and the implications this might have. He writes, if these results were reliable and significant, should pilots be expected to take such a medication? Can airline executives require this of pilots? Would they offer financial incentives to pilots willing to take these medications? Will the public, fearful of flying, pay more for these kinds of co-pilots? Closer to home, should post-call residents take modafinil to attenuate deficits in sustained attention brought on by sleep deprivation in the hospital? So I think these are very interesting examples, but they disrupt my moral intuition to some extent. Yes, there's a moral issue here, but is there a moral problem? Imagine that pilots who took the drug in question were really better pilots. Why wouldn't we want the competitive coercive dynamic to take hold if the enhancement was costless and safe? If you were to try to imagine what the protest of one of these pilots might sound like, it might be something like, quote, I have a right not to enhance and improve the safety of passengers. And the fact that it makes me a worse pilot, it makes it more likely that my plane will crash, that should not count against me in competing for this job, unquote, right? So maybe I'm a bit hard-hearted here, but I don't understand why we would give this a lot of credence in this example. If the same pilot said, let's take a non-biological enhancement, flight simulator time. I haven't spent as much time in flight simulator as that guy. He's obviously a better pilot, better trained, better instincts. But I still think you should be able to ignore that. You should have to ignore that when deciding whether to hire me. I think most of us would have a reaction against that kind of reasoning. So the question is whether the biological, non-biological line is doing a lot of work here that might be problematic in terms of the analysis. And if, like me, you think the biologic, non-biologic line, and I think like Elhague too, is actually a tenuous one and a hard one to defend, then I think it might disrupt our ideas here. There is another kind of objection that I associate with Michael Sandel related to what I call the love of randomness. My colleague Michael Sandel at Harvard seems to love randomness, right? He thinks in football in particular, the telos, to use the Aristotelian term, football and other competitive sports is inequality, the random distribution of talent. But that's really just a convention of the way our current system is set up. That random forces about who got what decide matches. But there are other random forces not about talent, like the direction of the wind, or how grass was cut on a particular day, that would still be relevant. There would still be chance involved in football. But to grant devil's advocate, let's grant to him that something would be lost if all players were allowed to use safe and free performance-enhancing drugs. We're imagining they're safe, we're imagining they're free to factor out these other objections. Okay, so let's take a look at me for a second, okay? So, do you think I could play football? I mean, judge me a little bit harshly here, right? I'm like 5'9.5" on a good day, right? Right now, and I know there'll be a day when I watch this video and I will regret saying this, I'm about 161 pounds, but I'll be much larger at some point in my life, I'm sure, right? There's no way I could ever play football. Let's put that aside. Imagine if there was a killer gym routine out there 325 days a week, 5 hours a day, I train and I become super Cohen, right? I become a much bigger sense of myself and I can play football. I'm talented enough. Now imagine there's also, that's weightlifting Cohen in one version of the world. Imagine there's a matter of moral luck here, right? Some people's bodies will respond better to weightlifting regimes than others. So even on this, if you'll pardon the pun, sweat equity theory, right? There is a difference here in terms of this. But imagine now that there is a pill out there that does exactly the same thing. Why is it that we think that weightlifting Cohen should be deserve the honorifics that pill-popping Cohen does not, right? Well, one answer is maybe one earned it and the other didn't. I said there's a problem there. But imagine the pill involved is extremely expensive. It's so expensive that pill-popping Cohen has to work a part-time job that's just as strenuous as weightlifting. He moves things around, but unfortunately doesn't build his body. 325 days of the year, 5 hours a day to afford the pill, right? So the same amount of effort has gone in. Why is it that one is so much better than the other? And if it turns out that pill-popping Cohen has to work harder than workout Cohen, why is it that one deserves it, not the other? And if it turns out that pill-popping Cohen has to work less hard, it's more efficient, why do we want these transaction costs of people getting involved? So I have other things I say on this, but I am concerned about Sandel's view of this. I'm running out of time, so I do want to share with you a little bit about Elhaig's take on this and where I think he does an important addition to the debate in particular, which is this notion of externalities, okay? So skipping down for a moment, I have to talk more about this in Q&A or outside. You can read it in the actual paper, right? Owing no doubt to part of his background in law and economics, and the fact that many of the people who write in these areas are somewhat hostile to economic thinking about the world, right? Einer has suggested that the chief problem with enhancement lies in the way it creates externality for others. He writes, so this is again, I hope his publisher doesn't blame me for quoting him a little bit there. He writes, situations where we cannot trust individuals to weigh the benefits and costs of their biological interventions because those effects are external to them, that is where we have to be worried. In particular, sometimes part or all of the benefits are transferred to them from others, or part of all the costs are shifted from them onto others. As a result, individuals who consider only the benefits and costs they personally experience will be agreeing to biological interventions that impose a net harm, including a net harm on themselves once one considers that other individuals will undergo similar interventions that inflict a net harm back. In sports competition, the benefits of a beta blocker reflect a transfer of benefits from one to the other. Only one athlete can win each Olympic medal. If one athlete wins by taking a beta blocker, that merely transfers that benefits to the using athlete from the non-using athlete. The use of the beta blocker may seem like it has a large individual benefit to the user, but it creates a zero total benefit to all set of persons. So the notion is here, in some contexts like that, as opposed to classical music, where there is an externalized benefit, if you're talking about a positional good, and you are generating positive or negative externalities, that is problematic. If, on the other hand, you are generating an absolute benefit, there are both positive and negative externalities. They have to be considered. And in cases where the negative externalities are greater than the positive externalities, that is the place for regulation. So I think that's right, and part of this project is to try to understand, is there anything else wrong with enhancement? And the last thing I'll just say, and I'm just going to mention this real quick, we can talk more, is I think something that hasn't been thought of enough, and is maybe the newest thing I say here, is try to understand why people want enhancement. In particular, when we talk about enhancing our children, I think there is a real problem if we think we're making our children better off. We're not. We're doing it at least by selection of gametes, for example, but maybe some of these other kinds too, like genetic manipulation or manipulation of a fetus. We are not making our children better off, a child better off. We're replacing our children with better children, quote unquote, or children that we think are better, right? This is not about preventing harm. This is not about giving gain to our children. This is not about the way in which we think parents appropriately act normally to try and make their children better off. This is instead something that is much more akin to the eugenics movement. It is to say, the world is better off if instead of this child, I had that child. Now again, you may have a theory that enhancement is desirable even on that ground, non-person affecting principle approach, or what I've called reproductive externalities elsewhere. But I want to press on to you that this is a much more difficult set of grounds than is often normally thought, and they are taking cover from the political theory idea. Everybody wants their children to be good, everybody wants their children to be happy, everybody wants their children to be better off. It's a much less clear thing whether we want to replace our children with other children. We wanted that. We could all use sperm banks. We could all use donor gametes. We could all basically make these kinds of decisions genotypically. The fact that many of us don't suggests to me that there may be a problem with this kind of thinking, but I'll stop it there and we can talk more.
We have a short time for questions, so I will waive my moderator's privilege, and I already see one in the back.
Professor Syed, I believe I pronounced it right. In your analysis of distribution fairness, how do you account for patients' life?
I already see one in the back.
Professor Syed, I believe I pronounced it right. In your analysis of distribution fairness, how do you account for patients' lifestyle failures? You talked about people who may have been crippled through no fault of their own. They may have a disease that they didn't cause. But what about people who smoke or eat improperly or don't listen to their doctor's advice? Where do they fit into the fairness calculus?
So that's a great question, and I'm going to kind of cop out by saying that I'm just doing the move that everyone else in the literature on this question does, which is to say we're now bracketing the question of the extent to which your health condition is a function of your prior lifestyle choices. That's something that may or may not be addressed through some way of factoring that in terms of not adjusting for that risk in allowing for people to enroll in health plans, etc.
I mean, should people pay more money if they live badly?
At a normative level, I think in principle, I haven't seen, but I mean, I know Einar has something on this in the article, and I can't quite remember what he says on it. I haven't seen anyone defend the idea that individual responsibility in principle is never relevant. So that's I haven't seen, but
I'll just say one thing on this is that one consideration, so what you're offering was a typical luck egalitarian approach to healthcare, right? That we want to factor in choices you make, option luck, from brute luck, choices that are not yours, right? So one thing that's often said against these luck egalitarians is actually about proportionality and a harshness objection. So a good example is somebody who drives drunk one day, right? One day of his life, crashes into a tree, right, and now needs a transplant or surgery, right? What we have to ask is the deficit that's imposed upon you by this bad responsible behavior proportional to the wrongfulness of behavior? And that turns out to be a hard thing to do, and also turns out a hard thing to know where in the system we think the decision makers should be made, right? Presumably, we don't want your individual doctor to be judging you for your lifestyle decisions. And now, do we think that the government should, right? The types of people who said, you know, keep your hands off my Medicare death panels, right? I mean, just to say that it's beyond the philosophical question of how much you think, whether you think it should matter, you then have a question of how much it should matter, and you have an administrative question about who should decide when it matters and how much it matters.
Well, should an insurance company charge a motorcyclist more for not wearing a helmet?
And skiers, right? So, you know, I love, so skiers all get all the benefits. It turns out skiing, this is going to be a public service announcement, skiing is very dangerous. Like, if you look at the healthcare costs caused by skiers to our system, that is an example of an expensive preference, right? So maybe we should charge skiers more, but most of us don't have that reaction, which suggests that there's something political going on here too, that it's not merely the view from nowhere of philosophy, that in fact these are constituencies that are powerful. The people in Aspen pay a lot of money to the politicians, whereas the people who are drunk drivers outside of maybe Hollywood don't really do that much.
Stephen, and then
this question's for Tala. I was really interested in the principles that you were talking about and your sort of dialectic towards them, and I wondered if there was a way that you might be able to, I mean, so the examples that you were talking about were you, the comparisons between you and Einar and your principle sort of works to make those kinds of comparisons. But it strikes me that this is actually one reason I find Larry Temkin's stuff like really sort of leaves me cold, is that, you know, talking about millionaires versus billionaires is not really sort of the relevant basis for comparison of the criteria that might be relevant or, you know, eligible to be relevant to make those kinds of discriminations or distributions might be completely different than the criteria if you're talking about, you know, sort of really rich people and people who are sort of, you know, comparatively way like badly off, not just worse off. And so I wondered if it's possible that your principle might be reformulated in terms of a discontinuity, had to have more of a discontinuous structure, and to say something like the principles that you're talking about really are that almost like presuppose a certain valence. Like, so if sufficiency is the valence, your principle might work really well on one side of the valence, but we might need a different kind of principle to govern distributions on the other side of the valence and distributions across the sort of transom.
So that's terrific, thanks. I'm sympathetic, but I want to say two sort of responses. One, I'm skeptical of a hard view of thresholds because people who have absolute sufficiency views tend to not take seriously trade-offs below and above them, and I think that's a problem, and I don't think there is any absolute threshold that's going to be plausible. Any threshold that seems attractive enough that we should bring everyone up to it will be unattainable for some, and any threshold that's completely attainable is just not a plausible threshold. So I think that's just going to be a problem facing any absolute sufficiency view. Now, should there be thresholds under which and below, above which the ratios vary? I haven't seen a persuasive argument that there should be necessarily a threshold. I mean, I'm not against the idea, but I just think the billionaire-millionaire example doesn't move me to think that there's nothing relevant there either. It's just maybe not as relevant as below a certain other threshold. I accept all that. Having said that, what I want to insist on is the idea that to some extent, people are making actually not judgments about, well, under this level, fairness matters differently than it does over this level. I think people are actually making a different judgment about, well, above this level, I actually don't think the amount of well-being is that different. So I think that's actually a judgment about how much goodness people are experiencing, and it's masking itself as a judgment about how much fairness matters at different levels. But having said all that, I take the point, and I just want to basically push back against the idea of any strong discontinuity. I'm okay with nonlinearity, but I'm not going to, I wouldn't accept discontinuity. Yeah.
I just thought I'd mention on the point about personal responsibility, I think that that problem is more easily addressed on the front end by taxing the bad behaviors in the first place, and then using those revenues to redistribute, but then allow on the insurance side blindedness to those behaviors. Because it also has, I also want to ask Tala a question about this second principle, the fairness principle, which is a non-utilitarian principle, I think, because you're not justifying it on diminishing marginal utility, which maybe you could.
No, absolutely not.
And it's also not you say it's not an egalitarian principle, right. And that's what I don't understand is where it comes from, because it also doesn't seem to be a maximin principle. It's not as if we're saying a decent minimum or a basic structure. So I guess help me understand its normative basis and how it really is distinct from egalitarian, because I think it operates equivalently to egalitarianism.
So that's great, thanks. I mean, and that gives me an opportunity to flesh it out a little. Yes, what I'm saying is that basically egalitarianism in the literature of sort of first principles has tended to be equated with the idea of giving people either caring about equality in itself or caring about people being badly off. I'm saying we don't care about we shouldn't care about equality in itself, and the Vonnegut example is perfect for that. It's in general, once you start caring about equality in itself, you get into the land of leveling down, etc. And what I think what should matter is that each person's life go as well as possible, given other people's competing claims. Now, that seems to me a more plausible starting point. Not that everyone's life go equally well, but that everyone's life goes as well as possible, given other people's lives, and given the competing claims that people's lives have on resources. Now, once you adopt that as your starting point, you realize that equality in itself isn't the aim, and you also move away from the alternative in the literature, which is by Derek Parfit and others, which is, well, if we don't care about equality, then what we really care about is some sort of non-comparative level of well-being. Are you doing badly off or not? And as long as you're not doing badly off, we're all fine. But I don't think that's plausible either, because there's no non-comparative absolute criterion of badly off. Badly off is judged by how well off other people are doing in light of social opportunity costs for different life projects. Now, it seems to me, therefore, we should think in terms of comparative principles, but not in terms of equality. So that's the sort of conceptual space that I'm moving in. I'm trying to suggest there's a new way of thinking, which is both comparative against utilitarianism and absolute prioritarianism, or non-comparative priority. but it's also against equality in that it's not about equality. It's just that it is the case that we want to see how much someone else should be improved given what it's going to sacrifice for other people, but not for the sake of equalizing them. But just simply that if your life is going not as well as someone else's, that seems to me, everything else being equal, gives you a greater claim because that other person is already having a good life. Not because we want to equalize you with them.
But you might be both be having a good life if you want to concede.
Sure.
But there's still an imperative to make the less one have a better life.
Exactly. As well is what I'm saying. I'm saying it's not about non-comparative goodness. It's about a comparative judgment all the time, is what I'm suggesting. But it's not about equality.
So my question is also directed at Paul on this idea of sort of absolute and objective thresholds. But I think it ultimately sort of ties into, Glenn, sort of how do we really match the legal options you propose with the taxonomy that you very, very thoroughly present. And so the whole time you're talking, Tom, I'm thinking of Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum's work on capabilities, right? And I'm so informed by not only international human rights law, but just sort of the idea that, sort of somebody may lack something in a given context that is ultimately meaningless for purposes of social inclusion, that may matter much more to somebody in different circumstances. And so I'm thinking through the sort of argument, and you sort of start out with benefit measurement and trading off. You end with this idea of the proportionate benefit sacrifice, and yet it just seems circular. Like I'm still back trying to figure out why your sacrifice should or shouldn't go to Einer. So I guess the short of my question is, why doesn't sort of the capabilities thesis take care of the absolute?
How does the capabilities thesis
sort of as a society we come up with a set of absolute.
Can I say something before you answer?
Sure.
So it's qualifier, right? So
Fine.
right?
So
So one possibility, Sam, is that you're distinguishing the currency of distribution from the distributional function. I think that's what you would say, right? So I hang out enough with this guy, right? So the idea is that, so the capabilities theory as proposed by Nussbaum has both, right? It has a currency, which are the capabilities, and then it has a distribution function, which is clearly sufficientarian, bring every threshold, but doesn't count hence below threshold or above threshold, right? I think the first part is compatible. Nothing Tala has said shows that he's like true welfareist, and he is compatible with everything he said to be to treat capabilities and functionings versus capabilities as the currency of distribution, and to the extent he differs from the theory, it would be on the distributive criteria. Is that all right?
Perfect. And I would simply thank you for that. So picking up from Glenn's perfect explication of the first half, what I'd say, the second half would simply be that Nussbaum says we should have everyone up to a universal level of capability, which is a basic sufficiency level, but then she doesn't confront the hard question of those who can't be brought up to. So it's my same response to Stephen. She's going to identify a sufficiency level, which is going to be either too high for everyone to be met, or everyone can meet it, but it's going to be too low to be really normatively plausible not to care about trade-offs above it. She's just going to face this problem, and she never addresses this question. And the alternative capability approach is not sufficiency, but equality. Well, that even faces the questions even harder now. Now, if you want to equalize everyone and access to capability, that's even going to face more trade-offs. So I actually am quite sympathetic to capabilities. I actually think it probably makes sense to have discrete, irreducibly plural dimensions or spaces of human well-being which cannot be easily traded off against each other. And we do that in our society all the time. We have healthcare, we have education, we have different spheres. We don't really do direct currency trade-offs between them, so that's fine with me. But within each sphere, you're going to have the same question. And I'm simply suggesting there's a different fairness principle than sufficiency or equality or maximization. That's basically it. Thanks.
We've got time. Not really, but we're going to take time for one more.
No,
please.
We
please.
can do it after over lunch.
Please.
Okay, so this kind of ties your two presentations together, I think, a little bit, which is, and it relates to the question of whether we can make distinctions between absolute and positional goods. I'm not sure that we can. So let's say take intelligence for example. Is that an absolute good ever? Or is it mostly just positional? So I discuss.
Well, you're asking the wrong. You're asking Tala. You're asking the wrong person, right? In terms of that, right? I find, I think there's positive externalities from his intelligence, but that's another matter, right? So I guess sit next to him. But I will say this, right? So that saying there are absolute and positional goods is not to say that there are only two types of goods. Most goods are mixed. But now, can we specify that? And nothing I've said meant to suggest the contrary. It's probably just not well put by me, and I think I would agree with this. But can we specify what proportion of a good, or if I gave you two goods to compare, can you say this one is more absolute and this one is more positional? I think the answer is yes, you can. So the deep, more skeptical point of your question would be that I can't even do that.
Yeah, that's my question.
But I think you can in the following sense. That again, I think that the Kantian formula is a good way of asking the question, right? And maybe we have to say it's on intelligence, but this much intelligence rather than more, right? I think disease resistance is a good one, right? Would I want to have disease resistance, would I want to be resistant to cancer if I had to make everybody else in this room resistant to cancer with me? I think the answer would probably be yes. Now maybe we'd have zero-sum questions about competition for other goods because you all live longer as a result or the like, and I'm worried about that. But for the most part, it seems to me that by doing that, asking that question, I can factor out what's positional versus what's not.
Although in a world of scarcity, is anything ever not positional?
Well, again, here's another example that I thought of. What about the idea that I could, one more example would be calories.
Oh, I just said in a world of scarcity, is anything ever non-positional?
So imagine we could change the human body in such a way that we required 1/10 of the caloric intake we currently need in order to survive a given day, right? Now that is an intervention that strikes me as absolute, and it's actually an anti-scarcity intervention, right? So at least I can come up with one truly absolute good that doesn't have a scarcity problem. So there, I don't hear anything more to say.
No, I'm pretty happy with
What would that do for the obesity problem?
Right, well, Thanks, Brock.